This is just going to be a little analysis of um my final speech from this year at nationals. It was an interesting speech. Um, there's definitely a lot of things that went well, definitely a lot of things I would have changed. So yeah, I think it'll be helpful for all of us. Um, yeah. So yeah, we're recording. All right. So um, yeah, that's me. That's me at WSDC Culture Night a couple of days ago. I just got back from Panama. Very fun. I'm Anthony. I do Extemp. It's a pretty fun event. So still improving. Uh, yeah, there's some things to improve on as you'll see in this speech, but yeah, I'm excited to analyze it. So yeah, let's cut to the chase. So national finals, this was my question options for the round. It was one, how will biodiversity loss in the Amazon shape global conservation? Two, a question about enforced disappearances. And three, one about Saudi Arabia Vision 2030, which is their economic plan to like build a bunch of skyscrapers and stuff. So you guys could like raise your hand or just put into the chat. Um, which question would you have taken and why? I'm curious to see your thoughts. So you can just raise your hand on Zoom or use the chat. Number two, because it's the one you know most about. Interesting. Jasmine?
I would say three because I would know the most about it, and then like I kind of like more political questions.
Mm, interesting. Lily?
I really like the Saudi Arabia one because I feel like there's a lot of angles that you could take with that one, especially because I
In-
feel like it's kind of working. Vision 2030 is kind of working, so there's impact.
yeah, maybe it's working. Who knows? Number two, because of number two, because of its advocacy, says Melinda. And Eliza said the first one on the Amazon because it's easier to impact. Interesting, interesting. And Myra agrees. I'm seeing a lot of ones and some twos and some threes. So we seem pretty split, which I think is interesting. And I think it says a lot about the different ways to approach this. Um, I don't think any of these questions are particularly like good or advantageous over the other. Um, but I ended up choosing the first one. So biodiversity loss in the Amazon. So I selected it for a couple of reasons. The first one, which I think is most important, and I actually forgot to include on the slide, is it's definitely the easiest to impact out of the three. And you can impact like the international community enforced disappearances one as well, but because it's fairly vague and broad, it's pretty difficult to impact specifically. Whereas the first one, it's kind of dual advantageous because there are the specific impacts to the Amazon and also the broader global impacts of things like climate change. So there's a lot of impacting angles you can take. Specifically for national finals, I wanted to take a question that had a lot of impacting work because I thought that, um, like, given the round, given the stage, given the circumstances, like, doing good impacting would be very advantageous for ranks. Um, which kind of shied me away from, oh no, the breakout rooms are closing. Okay. It kind of shied me away from taking the third question because comparatively, like, I don't know, like who cares about Vision 2030? Let's be real, right? Like it'll probably impact regional politics a little bit, but I didn't think it had as large or like grandiose of an impact as biodiversity loss. The other reason why I took it is because it's more answerable than the other questions, in my opinion. It's fairly specific. Global conservation efforts is pretty broad and vague, but it is something that you can define. Whereas, like, enforced disappearances in conflict zones is so broad. Like, there are so many different conflict zones. There are like 110 armed conflicts happening in the world right now. So it's very, very difficult to try and advocate for one response by the international community when there are so many different conflict zones and so many different circumstances in which the question applies. The other big problem with this second question is like, who is the international community, right? Like the United Nations, like realistically, probably doesn't have much power to do much about forced disappearances. And like you could take the angle of like specific countries like it's the US, but that's probably not like the international community either necessarily. So that question was fairly vague, and I didn't want to open up myself to questions, especially in cross-examination of if I answered the question or not. Because as I'm sure we all know, the number one rule of extemp is answer the question. So I didn't want to put myself at risk of not answering it due to the question's broad or vague nature. So that was the primary reason. Those were the primary reasons that I took this Amazon question. The other reason I took it is because it's definitely easier to do humor with the question. Whereas like I don't know, I mean, the Crown Prince is pretty funny. Like you could be funny with Saudi Arabia. The second question is definitely not one that's very conducive to like humor. Um, yeah. So those are the primary reasons I took this first question. I think there's a conversation to be had in extent about like how to be more strategic about question selection. And this is something I noticed even in the chat when you guys were saying like what questions you would take. Because a lot of people's reasoning was just I would take either one, two, or three because I know the most about it. So I think that says two things. The first is that like I think we should all as extempers be a little bit more comfortable taking questions that we're not very familiar with because from a strategic lens, right, like there are always going to be some questions that are better or worse than others. And even if we're slightly less comfortable with one, the opportunities of like impacting that it gives us are still something that we can definitely take advantage of, even if we're not very familiar with it. The second thing I think it says is just the benefits of reading a lot and extent. Like a lot of the knowledge that you'll see I kind of try to showcase throughout my national final speech is just things that I accumulated from like reading Foreign Policy magazine a lot over the course of like a year. And there were a lot of stories about the Amazon rainforest. It also explains the benefits of doing a lot of things like practice speeches because I've done a lot of questions on the Amazon rainforest. Even during nationals, I had 3 questions about Brazil. So it definitely contextualizes the benefit of like just practicing for extempers because I was definitely in a better circumstance for giving this speech given the previous knowledge I already had. Okay. Emma asks, as you get to higher levels of STEM, will you get less questions that could be answered with a yes or no, and more questions that make you be more imaginative? I would say not particularly. Like you'll always get questions, for example, like I don't know, like should Lula da Silva take more steps to combat deforestation in the Amazon? That can be answered with a yes or no. You'll also always get questions that allow you to kind of prescribe an answer, like how should the international community, et cetera, right? So I would say the answer is you'll see all types of questions regardless of what level of extent you're at. Okay, where's the video? Oh, there's the video. Okay. Let me know in the chat if you can hear it, but you should be able to hear it.
Speaker number 4 will answer the question, how will biodiversity loss in the Amazon reshape global conservation efforts? Code number 5018.
From bombs to tensions to now even the temperature, it seems like the only thing that's not getting hotter nowadays is our president. I mean, really, Donald Trump looks like if the Lorax didn't speak for the trees. However, soon he might not have any trees.
Any trees left to speak for. That's what he says. Okay. Yeah. Just keep going. There. Okay. So the AGD, right? Very funny. The structure of AGDs I think is very important and people often underestimate, right? Like often in AGDs we kind of tell our joke, but we don't really think in detail about the structure of what things will actually look like. There are a couple of problems with that. The first is that it kind of reduces like the potential funniness of the joke. And the second is like it often takes unnecessarily long to get through the AGD, which reduces the amount of time you have to give things like necessary context in the background. Um, so you want to aim to have a very specific structure for your attention getters. So the setup, the punchline, the segue, right? And here it's very, very clear, like almost signposted what these are, right? The setup is like from bombs to tensions to blah, 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 blah. The punchline is our president, and then the little Lorax thing. And then the segue is very clear. Soon he might not have any trees left to speak for. Like the setup, punchline, and segue, in my opinion, are like equally important. Like they cannot coexist without the other. This is like, like this is like biodiversity in the Amazon. Like if you kill one, like all of them die and like aren't effective. You know what I mean? So especially like we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the segue. I think it's something that a lot of people make a mistake of doing in Extemp nowadays. Like a lot of people try to be funny in Extemp, but even if the punchline itself is funny, like the joke doesn't really land if it's not connected or relevant to the rest of the speech. I think what makes this joke actually work is the segue of soon he might not have trees left to speak for it, because it makes it very, very clear to the audience, like why the joke was there to begin with, right? So when you're thinking of AGDs in prep, don't like stop at the punchline. Consider how the AGD connects to the rest of the speech and how you can make sure that like the joke lands and also that the joke makes sense. Because you don't want the judge to be confused by the end of your attention getter. Like if they're going to be confused, like let them be confused at your content and stuff. Don't let them be confused at the attention getter. You never want that at the start of the speech.
As the Council on Foreign Relations contextualizes, on January 4th of this year, the Amazon rainforest's biodiversity is rapidly degrading, with over 20% of the Amazon rainforest already destroyed, thousands of species in the Amazon rainforest at risk of extinction, and trees getting rid of by deforestation every single year. Hundreds of thousands of acres in the Amazon have been destroyed, and biodiversity is under grave threat, imperiling not just the Amazon rainforest, but the entire globe's efforts to control conservation of our people, our animals, and our planet. As the Council on
Oh my God, dude, I'm such a grandpa with Zoom, right? So the background, right? I think there's two purposes of the background. I was muted there. The first purpose is just to give the necessary context that the judge needs to understand um the circumstances in which the question takes place. And then the second point of the background is to foreshadow your answer to the question. I think that's a part of the background that like a lot of extempers tend to forget. But I think it's just far easier for the judge to understand and follow along with your speech if they like kind of understand the angle you're taking at your general logic and like storytelling of the question from the very beginning. So here you can kind of see the structure of my background is very much aligned with these goals and purposes of the background that I outlined at the top, right? So the A of the background, I said like the Council on Foreign Relations or something. The A is that the Amazon's biodiversity is degrading. That's the context you need to see to understand the question. B is how this connects to global conservation efforts. And I'm already foreshadowing at the fact that this will impact them very, very negatively. So that when I answer the question, it's not a surprise the angle that I'm taking. I think a lot of extempers kind of underestimate the importance of the background. Having a background that's very logical and organized and neat like this makes it very easy for the judge to follow along, um, to like follow along with your question and follow along with your logic of the answer. Um, there are a couple other things that I think you can notice if I'm like analyzing this. The first is I don't give any context that is not necessary to understand the question. In my opinion, context is like the most useless part of an extemp speech, right? Because it's time taken away from what you get to do with like argumentation, right? It's just that you have to do context so that the judges can follow along. So I think it's important, especially since 7 minutes is like not a lot of time, to give not any more context than is like absolutely necessary to understand the context of the question. The other thing to notice in the background is that I'm already trying to use as much specifics as possible. So like thousands of acres of the Amazon destroyed, and I'm trying to use numbers wherever I can. I think this just makes a good impression upon the judge immediately. Um, and it like gives an illustration of credibility for the extemper before I've even begun making the like weird arguments that I do throughout the speech. So it makes it easier for the judge to follow, and the judge just kind of trusts what you say to begin with, when you're making these like very credible statements. So if there's anything to take away from the background and apply to your own speeches, it's making sure to give context, but not any more context that is required before relating that context to the question in a manner that foreshadows the answer. That should be your primary goal with backgrounds in your speeches.
considering what the global climate clock quantifies. Ominously, 5 minutes ago, we have 4 years, 31 days, and 18 hours until the effects of climate change become irreversible. This isn't a minute problem in the Amazon. It's a potential catalyst for an environmental apocalypse. That's why we ask, how will biodiversity loss in the Amazon reshape global conservation efforts? The answer is worrying. It could devastate global conservation efforts. First, by rapidly expanding fossil fuel presence. Second, by silencing indigenous communities. And finally, by dramatically increasing carbon dioxide emissions into our atmosphere.
Cool. So the statement of significance, right? It's considering that blah 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 global climate clock. Um, Primary purpose of the statement of significance is to convey the gravity of the question. And I think it's important that extempors take like a very broad, sweeping approach to their statements of significance, right? Like frequently I see a lot of speakers just say like considering and then a statistic about whatever they're saying. In my opinion, that isn't really enough. Like the purpose of the statement of significance is not just to like make a factual statement about why it matters, but also to make like a bit of a rhetorical one, in my opinion. So if there's like anything to take away from this speech and like apply to your own, I think it's to encourage you to like push yourself to go even further in your SOS statements. And you can see the way that I attempt to do this in the speech. Like it's I think like from a delivery perspective, I make sure to slow down and it's a bit of a shift in my tone from like just like a deliverer of information to like a conveyor of emotion, right? You see like the way that my delivery itself is a little bit like worried, a little bit frantic. And the second thing is just like to kind of push yourself to go beyond just citing the source or just saying the statistic or just saying the number of people that are affected, right? It would have been so easy for me to get up there and be like, so considering that 30 million people live in the Amazon rainforest. Instead, I like went for this more so of a rhetorical appeal and like kind of eloquent way of delivering it. And it was so much more effective because it makes the audience care so much more, even if I'm citing like narrower statistics, right? So if there's a message to take away from this, it's that like you guys should just like push yourself in your statements of significance wherever possible to try and be strategic and like set yourself up for a speech that really, really matters. Because I think that's like the primary point of the SOS. And I think extempors like very frequently underuse it. Whereas I think, and this is an approach I took in most of my speeches at nationals, like if you really, really go for it and slow down and give it like the time it deserves, it can be very, very effective and very convincing. So, yeah.
But first, if you stacked $45 billion straight up into the air in $1 bills, it would stretch thousands of miles high, which is also the height that I tell people when I'm lying about how tall I actually am. However, $45 billion is also the value of oil and gas within the Amazon rainforest. That's the first way the loss of biodiversity there will devastate global conservation efforts. It's by, first, dramatically increasing fossil fuel presence. The Global Non-Proliferation Treaty for Fossil Fuels, an internationally recognized nonprofit, illustrates on October 24th of last year. The Amazon rainforest's once thriving biodiversity encouraged the Brazilian government to protect it from fossil fuel corporate interests. This helped keep fossil fuels out of the Amazon, the industry that controls 75% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Yet as biodiversity has grown vulnerable in the Amazon rainforest, fossil fuel companies have increased their presence there, imperiling global conservation efforts. Indeed, the nonprofit magazine The Amazon Watch warns, worryingly, just 3 days ago, using the excuse that biodiversity loss in the Amazon rainforest has become inevitable, the Brazilian government has permitted its state-owned oil company, Petrobras, to produce billions of dollars worth of oil and natural gas within the Amazon rainforest, destroying thousands of acres of land. While it's making a lucrative profit, It's dealing lucrative damage to the environment and the entire globe's efforts to conserve the Amazon rainforest. Fossil fuel companies threaten to turn all of us into fossils, and the biodiversity loss of the Amazon rainforest are only digging us deeper and deeper into the darkness of our self-inflicted grave.
So yeah, there are a couple things you can notice here. The on top is like, yeah, like, it kind of bombed, right? But like there were like 5 people in the audience because like, some events took place the day prior, right? Um, so yeah, but even then, like I think there's something you can take away from this on top, right? Is that like it's the same kind of structure that I emphasized prior with AGDs, right? So setup, punchline, segue, right? Um, and I think if anything, like the fact that this joke like didn't get as many laughs as I would have wanted probably emphasizes the thing that I was saying before about why relevance of jokes is very, very important. Like I probably could have figured out something I could have told which would have been like a little bit more relevant and a little bit more connected to fossil fuels so that the joke didn't feel as injected into the speech. So that's something I would have changed if I was going to give this speech again. Um, and moving forward to future speeches, I think all of you guys can see that a joke is always going to be way more funny if it seems like it really connects to the speech and the topic at hand. So yeah, that's the on top. The substructure here is very like signposted, and I use it consistently throughout the speech in all 3 points. So it's just past, present, future, and that's the sequence of my argument. So the A in each point, I explain like what the past was or what the history was in the Amazon rainforest and why before biodiversity loss happened, the Amazon was really helpful for global conservation efforts. So here, Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative says when the Amazon was full of biodiversity, the Brazilian government felt compelled to protect it from fossil fuels. Then so that's like the past, right? That's a historical context in which each argument takes place. The B is like where you answer the question, right? And explain why biodiversity loss is going to negatively impact global conservation. So here I say, because biodiversity has been cooked in the Amazon rainforest, the Brazilian government now has an excuse to extract oil and natural gas from it, which is really, really terrible for global conservation efforts because fossil fuel companies are like really terrible for this whole variety of reasons. If I was going to deliver this again, there were other statistics I would have hoped to include. I had on my flow, I remember that like I think like 20% of like all new recently discovered oil and natural gas reserves in the world are in the Amazon rainforest, which explains like the urgency of why this is happening now and very specifically like why the Brazilian government is trying to extract so much through Petrobras. Um, there's another statistic like fossil fuel companies, I think, are responsible for like 70% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions, which would have supported my argument that this degrades like global conservation efforts and made the link from the Amazon to the whole world's fight against climate change way more clear. So if I was going to give this speech again, that's something I would probably change. Other than that, I think there's other things that you can notice. The first is like the way I strategically use my sourcing. And like I think it's obvious that like could have obviously done this entire speech like only citing the New York Times and Reuters, right? Because like they report on everything. But I went out of my way to try and cite interesting sources. And I always try to cite regional sources in all of these types of speeches that are international. So like I don't know, like if I'm doing a question on like India and Pakistan, you could cite like the Kashmiri Observer or something like that. Um, I think citing regional sources just gives the speaker more credibility. So here I think I cited like the Amazon Watch or something, which was reporting on Petrobras's oil development. So that's something to notice that like even though I'm saying fairly standard, easily accessible information that's in the mainstream, I made sure to try and find sources that were very, very niche to back up my credibility. And that was something I aimed to do throughout the speech, and that I think I did fairly successfully here. The other thing I think that is important to notice in this point is my rhetoric and the way that I end the point. I think a lot of extempers nowadays on the circuit like kind of struggle with how to end their points succinctly. Like a lot of people just say like, and that's the first reason that biodiversity loss will harm the Amazon rainforest. And that's fine, right? But I think I regard it as like kind of a missed opportunity, right? Because there are so many ways that you can succinctly end a point in Extemp in a way that's like very satisfying and meaningful. So here I just tried to go for rhetoric all the time. So here I said like we're digging like we're self-digging our own grave or something like that. And that kind of imagery is very, very impactful. I could have easily just like ended off with a statistic of how like we're kind of dooming ourselves against climate change. But it was a strategic choice to try and go for rhetoric here instead, because it makes the speech far more meaningful to the average judge, right? Like the average judge will just care like the average judge will care more about if you're able to tell things meaningfully rather than you just like citing sources and statistics because like Google can do that too, ChatGPT can do that too. Like doing interesting rhetoric and ending your point like this with strategic power lines is a good way, A, to just like kind of economize your words and move on to the next point quickly and easily. And two, um, and second, like it's just an easy way to end your speech and end your points rather in a way that's very, very impactful and carries the kind of meaning of the speech as a whole. The other thing I think you can analyze here is that like I'm already trying to kind of thread like the overarching narrative or thesis of my speech, which I never really like say, but is heavily implied throughout the speech, which is that like this is our fault. Like if there isn't like an emotion that I wanted the audience to feel while listening to this, it's probably like guilt, right? Because it's very, very powerful and it relates the speech directly to the audience themselves. Um, like getting the audience to really care about topics and extent is difficult, but if you're able to do it successfully, it's something that is very, very helpful. And here I think it's a large reason of like why the speech ranked fairly well. Um, so yeah, if there's anything to take away, it's the importance of using things like rhetoric to help cement your point. Because even if it's not like very argumentative in nature, it still does serve a purpose. Even if it's abstracted, like definitely does serve a purpose. Maya asked in the chat, would you recommend using rhetoric for all Cs or impact points? Or are there some impacts where you should just have statistics and which questions? I think it's like largely personal preference, right? Like I feel like it's largely up to like your objectives as a speaker. Like if you're trying to answer the question in a fairly objective manner, then um then using statistics is definitely something that's going to back up your point. But I think in this circumstance specifically, I was going for largely like emotion and advocacy throughout the speech. And that's why I think rhetoric was a good choice to make strategically. Um, so I don't think there are like necessarily specific questions and which one is right over the other. At least my personal approach towards it is like if I have a speech where I'm trying to like really make a point or thread like a narrative that impacts the audience throughout, um, rhetoric is like I don't use it like all of the time, right? Like don't put all of your eggs in one basket, but it is something that is obviously like very, very helpful to making good arguments.
But second, while we all call the Earth our home, there's only one group that really gets to do so. The second way biodiversity loss in the Amazon rainforest could destroy global conservation efforts is by silencing indigenous communities. Indeed, as NASA writes on October 4th of last year, indigenous communities once thrived off of the biodiversity of the Amazon rainforest. It sustained a population of 1.5 million indigenous people, over 350 ethnic groups, which wasn't just a thriving community. Those communities also protected the land from corporate fossil fuel and agricultural interests, protecting the globe's efforts to conserve the Amazon rainforests and forests internationally as a whole. But as biodiversity has suffered across the Amazon, indigenous communities have bared the costs. Indeed, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative explains, in conjunction with the World Wildlife Fund, in November of 2022, now indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest are twice as likely to die of wildfires as the average citizen, precisely because of the loss of biodiversity. Hundreds of thousands have been forced to vacate their ancestral homelands, meaning not just a humanitarian tragedy, but a population vulnerable to corporate threats, with over 40,000 acres of the Amazon rainforest destroyed by agriculture companies last year alone, because indigenous communities weren't there to protect the territory. As the Amazon rainforest continues to suffer, not just will the environment suffer, but hundreds of thousands of indigenous people will be forced to leave their ancestral homeland and potentially never return. But
Okay, cool. So there are a couple of things I think you can notice. The first is on the on top. Like, I hope this kind of hammers in the point that like you don't have to be funny. Sorry. You don't have to be funny all of the time and extent. I'm sick right now. Um, like I think I did have a funny on top for this, but I was running behind on time for like pretty badly, even by final standards where like the time is a little bit lax. So I wanted to just like kind of economize my words and move on to the next point. Um, yeah, there are still other points of on tops other than like just being funny, right? Like I think having on tops that just give information can be very helpful. And here, I think the strategic purpose of what I did is that, like, already before the point even starts, I've set the premise that Indigenous communities are very important and worth protecting, which makes it easier for the judge to understand the importance and why this point strategically matters. The other thing to notice, sick. The other thing to notice is the way that I like organize my substructure, right? Because substructure isn't just like A, B, C, like past, present, future, right? I think it's also about like the way we organize the A and the B and the C. You know what I mean? So the way that I tend to structure things is like through claims and warrants internally. So for example, in the A, I think it was I don't remember what the source was, but as the source explained on whatever date, then I would say the claim, right? Which is that Indigenous people protected the biodiversity of the Amazon rainforest. That's the overarching claim of the A. And then the warrants and the evidence to back it up. So the claim is kind of like derived from the source, and the warrant is like what the source actually says, if that makes sense. So the warrant in this case is like because they had land rights to the Amazon rainforest, it's impossible to do things like illegal logging or agriculture when there's like actively people there holding the land rights and property rights, right? Whereas if there's nobody there, I don't know, it's like squatters' rights, right? Like they can just take the land and there's nobody to stop them because there aren't police or park rangers there either. Um, and the B, you can see me doing the same structure, right? It's like the claim is without biodiversity, and indigenous people have been forced to flee, which opens the Amazon up to corporate exploitation. And then the warrants are the things that the source actually says, right? Which is like indigenous people are twice as likely to be victims of natural disasters. The fact that they have left by the hundreds of thousands is, it's a humanitarian tragedy. And also it makes the Amazon rainforest more vulnerable, which kind of degrades global conservation efforts as well. And that's what the impact points out. I think the impacts rhetoric here is another thing to notice. I don't think it was as strong as the first point, partly because I was badly running behind on time. Um, but yeah, it's just something to notice how like I try to hammer in the point that like not just is this something that's pretty bad for global conservation, which answers the question, but I also go further than what the question really prompts and explain how this will affect people's livelihoods. I mean, these are communities that have been in the Amazon, like endemic to the Amazon for thousands of years that are being forced to leave because of these man-made tragedies, right? And that kind of further cements to the audience the point I'm already trying to get at, which is that like it is like the international community's like apathy that has kind of caused all of the problems that we're seeing now. Yeah. The other things to notice are like there's a bit of a tonal shift throughout the speech, which is like it starts like kind of just ominously, and then the first point is just like continuing that kind of ominous tone. The second point has like more of an edge to it, and then I think you'll see like in the third point, I kind of try to bring it down slightly. Um, because you never want to have just kind of monotone speaking throughout the speech. And it wouldn't even necessarily be monotone, but rather like constant emotion and a lack of variety throughout the speech. Even in a speech like this, which is fairly intense, you want to have tonal variety throughout, which is something I try to go for throughout this second point. Um, One person asked, how do we find robust sources? I think it comes from like specific searches through search engines. So for example, like I think for the first point, like I put in like a lot of keywords, and I also like if you just put think tank or scholarly at the end of your Google search, you'll like instantly get better results. Like little secret there, right? So that makes it easy to try and find robust sources. And then when you're searching after you've like typed in the search in prep, like literally just start from like the longest source name, honestly, and then work backwards from there. Like that's literally why I cited like the Global Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I mean, like don't actually do that, but like look for sources that appear credible and have like highly credible author names behind them because that's a great place to start for credibility. So yeah, main things to notice and apply to your own speeches, I would say, are like um, trying to shift your tone throughout your speech to make it continuously engaging, especially in your second point, which is when some like more lax judges will start to tune out, and trying to find robust sources wherever possible. Okay.
Third, so long as carbon emissions continue increasing, we are literally and metaphorically cooked. And that's the third and final way biodiversity loss in the Amazon rainforest threatens the entire globe's conservation efforts. It's by increasing the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The US's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association explains in a scholarly analysis in February of this year, the Amazon rainforest is our largest global asset in the world's effort to conserve the environment, containing 123 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, absorbed over decades. The Amazon rainforest guarantees that we are able to undo what has threatened to destroy our entire planet. Yet, as the Amazon rainforest biodiversity has suffered, the Amazon's ability to control international emissions has suffered as well. Brazil's Sao Paulo National Institute of Space Research released a worrying scholarly report in July of 2021. The Amazon rainforest is now emitting more carbon dioxide than it's absorbing, undoing centuries of climate progress that the Amazon rainforest advanced for humanity. With 123 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, 3 years of global emissions contained within the Amazon rainforest, and 4 years left until climate change becomes irreversible. The death of biodiversity and forests within the Amazon rainforest is a matter of life and death.
Sick. So yeah, and you'll see like a lot of what I was talking about in previous points repeated within this. I use the same substructure throughout all 3 points. I guess for two reasons. The first is that like it's easier for the judge to follow. The second is that I find speeches like easier to memorize when the substructure is constant, especially in like circumstances like this where it's obviously like a high pressure environment. Having a speech that you can like reliably memorize is very important. The on top, it's the same thing that I was talking about before, right? Setup, punchline, segue. I think this on top could have been stronger if there was a stronger segue into the third point, i.e., because of carbon dioxide emissions, the whole world is only getting hotter, right? Like literally metaphorically cooked, it connects to that, right? So yeah, like practice what I preach. If I was gonna do this speech again, I would probably try to have a better segue there. Other than that, I think there's a couple other things you can notice within the content. The primary one is like how specific my sources actually are. And it's not just about like the name of the sources, it's about the content of what it says, right? Like citing the National Institute of Space Research is cool, but I think what mattered more in this context is like the specific like 123 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. Just saying that is so much more convincing than the Amazon is a large carbon sink, right? Because it makes you A, seem like you know what you're talking about, which is just always perceptually good. And B, it provides like very specific evidence that makes your argument better because it allows me to like do my little debate math at the end, which is like this is 3 years worth of carbon dioxide emissions, and there's 4 years left until actually 3 years now, there's 3 years left until climate change becomes irreversible and we hit the tipping point, which will be really, really terrible. Um, so yeah, that's one thing I think like you guys can take away and try to apply to your own speeches, which is like the importance of like using like numbers, like just citing more numbers is pretty much always a good thing. You don't want to overload your speech with statistics because it takes away the amount of time you have to like do your own analysis, right? But having those specific numbers that are backing up your sources and backing up your argument are pretty much always going to make you more convincing. There are a couple areas of my delivery that I think would have been better. The first is that I think my A point within this third point should have been like a little bit softer tonally and with regards to my delivery, because that would give me more variety so that when I get really serious at the end and I'm like we're all gonna die, guys, like it's doesn't seem forced because that degree of like severity of my delivery hasn't like existed yet, right? So if you get softer before, it makes like the louder parts of the speech more impactful because there's more contrast and more variation. Yes, it was past, present, future self-structure. Sorry. The other thing is like in my rhetoric, I think it was fine here. But I do have like a slight tendency watching back to overuse certain words. Like I think I used the word suffer like 5 times over the course of my second and third point. And like, yeah, they're suffering, but like, I don't know, they're not suffering that much, right? So I would, looking back, I think what we can apply to like all of our speeches going forward is like the importance of variety, not just in like your tone and in your delivery, but in your word choice and in your language, so that the judge doesn't perceive anything as repetitive. Other than that, you can see me doing the same kind of organization that I did in my first and second points, right? Differentiating between my claims and my warrants, and trying to emphasize the impacts of what I'm talking about to kind of thread my like storytelling and narrative through about the importance of this question and why this question matters. Like I think especially, and you'll see this in the next slide, like the point I was trying to get at with this speech is like the urgency of environmental action. And that goes far beyond like the Amazon rainforest with the way I answer the question. Like I kind of just perceived it as the means to my end of general environmental advocacy. Um, yeah, yeah. So like if there's a message to take away from that, I think it's just like thinking of how we answer questions in big rounds strategically and the messages and stories we can tell, because those are very important in how these final rounds end up ranking out. Um, so if you can think about how you want to approach the question as soon as you draw it, that can set you up for with a very strong foundation for a good speech.
I don't want this speech to be a message of doom. This speech should be a wake-up call, answering the question, how will biodiversity loss in the Amazon rainforest impact the globe's conservation efforts? The answer is ominous. It could devastate them, be it by expanding fossil fuel corporate presence, devastating indigenous communities, or worsening the Amazon rainforest's ability to absorb carbon dioxide emissions. While Donald Trump might be orange like the Lorax, it's time for the international community to stop speaking for the trees and start actually acting to save them.
So there's a couple of things to notice. On my statement of significance here, um, there are like, yeah, um, so a lot of extempers just finish their third point and go straight to the conclusion, be it for time or be it because they just haven't prepared a second statement of significance. But I think that's like a huge missed opportunity in my opinion. Like you want to end your speech on a high note, in my opinion, and I think it's just really lame to end your speech with like, thank you, and then just like dip, you know what I mean? So the point of this like second statement of significance I give, where I kind of make it personal, I use like personal pronouns and that type of thing, is like first just because like I don't want to end the speech on a very, very low note or on a kind of monotone note, because I feel like that's kind of a waste of the energy I've built up throughout the speech. Like, if anything, like the climax of the speech is more this part of the conclusion and not even like the third point as it is for most other speeches. The other point of this second statement of significance is to like personalize the impact to the judge. My personal like approach to these significant statements is like my first statement of significance in the intro is typically pretty broad and sweeping and explains the gravity of this for the world. And my second statement of significance kind of like explains the gravity of it for the individual or for the judge. And I think you can see the way that kind of philosophy reflected in this speech, where my first significant statement in the intro is very broad and reflective of the global fight against climate change. Whereas in the second part, when I'm transitioning to my conclusion, it's more so like just talking to like the audience as people rather than reflecting or even answering the question. So yeah, I think especially in like a big round like this, it was particularly impactful, and I think it definitely helped my ranks just because it made the speech about like more than just answering the question, right? It made the speech a little bit less superficial and more real. And I think that was very, very important. The recap was very clean, very short. In my opinion, like conclusions in Extemp shouldn't be like longer than 30 seconds. Like it's just kind of a waste of time to repeat what you've already said in any circumstance, in my opinion, especially when you only have 7 minutes, right? Like every second can be used for something that is impactful. And I think like repeating yourself in the conclusion is like kind of a waste of time. Like, I don't know. I haven't given like a full like minute long conclusion like Extemp is traditionally in like a really long time just because I just like run out of things to say. Um, yeah. And then the zinger, which is like a callback to the AGD, right? It's the last line after you repeat your first, second, and third points in the recap. I think a lot of people also don't use this very effectively, and it's like just a missed opportunity in my opinion, right? Um, I think it's like an opportunity to call back to the attention getter and wrap up in a very succinct and fulfilling way. And it's also just an opportunity to cement your argument, right? And here I think I did that fairly well. Like it was both a callback to the attention getter in that it's like, Lorax, like, remember that funny joke I made 8 minutes ago? And also simultaneously kind of once again really cementing the idea that it's like our responsibility to take action. So I think like if you guys are like trying to apply this speech to yours, like even if it isn't like a super passionate speech or anything, like even if you're just like clowning on Trump or something and it's that kind of speech, you can still have an interesting statement of significance within the conclusion. You can still have an interesting callback to the attention getter. Those are things that will exist regardless of what the question is. So there are always more opportunities to impact the judge and make the most of your question. And I think this conclusion was a good example of Emma asked, do you think that conclusion should be a little call to action? Appreciate it, Emma, preach. Yeah, like, I mean, like, not every speech has to be a grandiose call to action. You know what I mean? Like, you're not like calling for people to like get off their seats and do something about every question. Inevitably, you're gonna get like some question about Canadian politics or something where you can just like sit and observe. You know what I mean? But so not necessarily do conclusions always have to be a call to action, but they should always be like impactful, if that makes sense, in my opinion. So like, I don't know, if you have like, did the Conservatives blow the Canadian election, which is a question I answered a while ago when I was prepping for NATS. Like, there is no call to action you can create out of that. You know what I mean? Like we live in the US, like what are we supposed to do about Canada, right? But you can still say like you can still connect it to US politics, you can still connect it to the future of Canada's politics or Canada's economy. There are still broader connections you can make that aren't necessarily like a call to action, but are still fairly impactful and make the question matter. So, sorry, very sick. If you're thinking about like how you can wrap up your speech, like even if it isn't like a question about conflict or a question about climate change or a question about this like large pressing global issue, I think there's always a way that like even if the conclusion isn't impactful, that can just be interesting, and that's better than nothing in my opinion. Yeah. I included cross here as well. This cross is fairly interesting, so I decided to include.
Our fourth speaker will be cross-examined by speaker number 3.
Hey, I just want to say what a great speech.
Thank
I
you.
have a few questions to go along with it.
Of course.
So your first point talks about oil and gas drilling within the Amazon rainforest. But if President Lula da Silva of Brazil has committed to reducing oil and gas drilling within the entirety of the Amazon rainforest by the year 2030, How exactly does your point still stand?
Yeah, that's the problem. That is an incredibly greenwashed goal. We can pretend we're going to be net zero by 2030 in the Amazon rainforest all we want, but actions speak vastly louder than words. Look to the billions of dollars in oil and natural gas development that Lula da Silva himself has permitted Brazil's state-owned oil company of Petrobras to conduct within the Amazon rainforest. So long as Lula da Silva allows the Amazon rainforest's biodiversity to die and fossil fuel companies to continue polluting this precious territory, the entire international community's efforts to conserve the planet will suffer.
Great, thank you so much. Let's talk about your second point, which is specifically related to the increase of agricultural farmland within the Amazon rainforest. If at the United Nations there have been many different attempts over the course of the last 5 years to use UN resources to fight agricultural farmland in the Amazon rainforest, again, how does that point still stand?
That's the key word in your question. Attempts, not successes. The United Nations has tried to control agricultural development within the Amazon rainforest, but what was preventing that agricultural development from happening was millions of indigenous people who stood up for their land rights and their territory. Without their presence, because they don't have the biodiversity they need to survive, there isn't anything stopping agricultural companies from polluting the territory. Last year, 40,000 acres of the Amazon rainforest was destroyed by these very companies. The United Nations can pretend that it's acting all it wants, but once again, actions speak louder than words. The Amazon rainforest is dying, and the international community is not doing enough to stop it.
Thank you so much.
Sick. Yeah, unfortunately, cross at nationals is only 2 minutes, which is something I personally think should change because, like, I don't know, he only got to ask 2 questions, right? But yeah, cross examination. There are two goals I attempt to achieve in cross. The first one is to like appear perceptually like over the questioner, and the second one is to try and drive in the point of your own speech. And I think I tried to accomplish both of those goals in this cross examination. Like, so the first one on like relations with the questioner, like obviously like be respectful, guys. Like don't interrupt them. Like it just looks terrible for you. So obviously be respectful, right? But I tried to paint the questioner as like misinterpreting or taking my speech out of context. I mean, like he was asking excellent questions, right? And it's like kind of a different, it's like a weird speech to attempt to cross-examine because you don't want to get up there and be like, climate change isn't real, you know what I mean? But um you can try to like make it appear as if the questioner has misinterpreted your speech, which appears like pretty perceptually good in the eyes of the judges. Like when I took like the wording of his question and said like that's the key word attempts, like the judges nodded because they understood the point I was trying to make, which is that like the way that the questions were being asked was kind of the entire point of the speech, right? Is that like we say that we are doing all of these things, but evidently they are obviously not working. And then the other point of cross-examination is to hammer in or clarify any points of the speech that you may have missed, now that you have 2 more minutes to explain them. I especially tried to do that in the second point because I think that in the speech, the claim about like indigenous land rights came out a little bit unclear, and I wasn't clear enough about like it's the fact they like own the property that prevents multinational companies from coming in and exploiting the land. So um, that was the other goal that I had within this cross-examination was to clear up any missing points or points that didn't make that much sense throughout the speech. And I think I did that fairly effectively. Like in response to the second question, I re-explained my second point in a way that made a little bit more sense. And I think that definitely helped clarify things because coming out of the speech itself, I think the second point was a little bit confusing, honestly. It's just a lot of like logical hurdles to jump through to understand the argument, even if the argument is true and makes sense. So having cross-examination is valuable, even if it's only 2 minutes. I think like a lot of extempers are fairly passive in cross and don't really use it to its fullest extent, largely because cross doesn't like exist in a lot of places, right? So it's difficult to be strategic about it. But I think if you guys are gonna like try and apply the way that I approach this speech to like your own speeches and your own crosses, I would say when asking your questions, be very clear and try to ask like succinct yes or no questions so that the speaker can't just like stray away. Because like, I mean, the way that I answered these questions, I was kind of filibustering away from them the entire time. I mean, I gave very long answers. He only got to ask two questions, right? So ask very direct questions that allow you to extract like a yes or no answer strategically and go from there. And then when you're on the receiving end of cross-examination, try to use it strategically and clarify your own points while appearing perceptually good in the eyes of the judges. Yeah, if you guys haven't done debate in your extempers, I would suggest just doing debate, right? Because it's great practice for cross-examination. If you're doing like PF or Worlds, well, Worlds doesn't have cross, but you know, you can answer POS, I guess, right? Those are both very good events for practice for extemp cross. Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, so kind of like what you said earlier, cross-X doesn't really exist in a lot of local circuits, so I just have like a ton of questions about it. So, like when you ask your questions, like are you allowed, do you only make questions just from like that person's speech, or are you allowed to like research a little bit about it? Or like at that point, should you already know enough that you can like ask questions without like looking up anything? Or um and then also, like, um, how, you know what, just answer my first question. I kind of forgot what my second question was.
Yeah, you're good. Don't worry about it. So, you actually don't have the internet for cross. Like, they just give you a flow pad and a pen, and they're like, write extemporary, you know? So, you can't research anything while the speech is going on. So, you just have to kind of use prior knowledge, and use like the context that the speaker gives you in the speech if you're unfamiliar to be able to ask questions.
Okay, and then I remembered my second question. So I think you said earlier that like at Nats it's 2 minutes or something. So then what is it normally?
Yeah, so NSDA rules are 2 minutes, so most tournaments, unfortunately, are only 2 minutes long for cross. At other tournaments, like if you go to the Extemp TOC or NBA round robin, they do 3 minute cross, which gives you more opportunities to ask questions or like prod at the other speaker's speech. Which I personally prefer because otherwise you only get to ask like two questions and it's kind of just like I don't know, it's kind of just like a tradition, right? But you don't really get to do anything, you know what I mean? So, yeah, most of the time nowadays it's 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's the analysis. Hope you enjoyed. Definitely a lot of things I would change, a lot of things that went well. Definitely a very different speech from the one I gave last year, but it was pretty good. It turned out pretty well. So yeah, I can stay for about 10 minutes if you guys have questions, and then I unfortunately have to eat lunch. Very unfortunately. But yeah, thank you guys so much for showing up. Appreciate it. Hope you're enjoying the camp. Hope you're finding it valuable. Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, so another question is, do you like, do you get ranked separately, like your speech and your performance in Crossix? Is that like ranked separately, or will judges like hear your speech, think it's really good, but if you do badly in Crossix, then will they rank you down? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's just one rank. There's no separate rank for cross. So like it's like if you do very, very good in cross, they may increase your rank slightly. If you do very, very bad in cross, they may decrease your rank slightly. Honestly, I think cross has a fairly marginal impact on your ranks. Like it is mostly the speech at the end of the day. But if you're able to make um, significant progress against the opponent in cross, it'll definitely help you. It'll probably harm them slightly. But honestly, like, I don't know, if you're in cross for like the first time, sometime eventually, like, don't sweat it too much because cross doesn't really implicate ranks that much, I wouldn't say. It's some judges care about it a lot, some judges don't care about it at all and don't flow it. So I wouldn't think too much of it because it doesn't matter nearly as much as like the actual speech that you give.
Okay. So then how do you know how come it's not in like most local circuits? Or if you don't, that's fine. I was just curious.
Just like time. I mean, like I don't know. Like some people just think it's like a waste of time because like a lot of extempers don't ask good questions. I don't know, but like yeah, like at NSDA it starts in semis. I think part of it is just like it's logistically difficult. Like if draw gets messed up, like people get stuck in the room and then it kind of throws off the tournament. So yeah, hopefully
Uh,
it's good. Yeah.
okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Uh-huh.
I have two questions. They're both about like the your word economy. Just like
Yeah.
in your entire speech, using like a very robust vocabulary. So, what were your strategies before nationals or before any major tournament to like sound more clear and not mess up when you're like giving those big words in your speeches?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think my like vocabulary and the way that I articulated things did definitely help me in nationals. Like it was something a lot of judges commented on. Um, I don't know. I mean, like if anything, I think it's just that I read a lot, so it's easier to use like very robust vocabulary when you read a lot of the news and you read a lot of analysis and like I don't know, people who are PhDs talk in a really like convoluted way. So it's easier to pick up on their big words, right? Um, so yeah, like if you want to like incorporate very long words into your speeches, I think if anything, just like read some more foreign affairs magazine. They use a lot of big words. Um, like like just reading from think tanks and magazines is just a good way to improve your vocabulary. And I think it's also just a good way to improve your fluency as well. Other than that, like I think it's just something that you develop over time if you give a lot of speeches. Like you become accustomed to saying like fairly complex sentences while still being comfortable. So yeah, like I think if there's like a message to take away from that, it's just the standard processes of extemp, reading the news and practicing giving speeches are helpful in that regard when it comes to vocabulary.
That for like action words when you're introducing articles, what are your strategies for that?
Um, I wouldn't say I have like specific strategies. Like I think there's just like some words I really like illustrates like dang I'm like that's a good word, you know what I mean? So um I think it's just something I've developed over time and it became like kind of unique to my style. Like I just think saying explains over and over again is like kind of boring, right? So like it's just kind of a me thing. Like I wouldn't like overtly recommend that other people do it if it's like not something they're into or it's not their style. Like inevitably there's going to be stylistic differences. That's why no extemper is like another. Um, so yeah, I wouldn't say there's like a specific strategy for that. Um, yeah, wait, just quickly, Elisa asked in the chat, how do you tend to structure your prep and does it change based on the question? Um, It doesn't really change based on the question for me. It may change if like you're not very familiar with the question, you may have to spend more time prepping. For me, like I typically spend about 14 minutes researching and about 16 minutes practicing. But like, I don't know, my general advice for that is that people are so different. Like I know people who have final nationals prepping for 5 minutes and speaking for 25. And I know people who final nationals doing completely the opposite, right? So um I think like it's just really varies from person to person. And like just because I prep for 14 minutes doesn't mean that you should as well, because people do entirely different things, even among just this year's finalists. There's so much different variation. So it's very individualistic. Often.
I wanted to ask, how do you come up with original jokes and punchlines um during the prep or before the prep?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a lot of it is just like reading a lot. Like honestly, like a lot of the time at this point, I'll just read and be like, that's kind of funny, right? And then I'll write it down. Like the whole Lorax thing, like I just came up with that in my head. I didn't read it from anywhere. Um, yeah. The important thing that you guys should note is that like you're not allowed to use like prepared resources in the room. So like I have like a document where I write stuff down, but you're not actually allowed to like use that in the room. So like you should have things in your head that you can like use extemporaneously. Like if you use a canning document, get like disqualified, and I won't want that for any of you guys in the like in the prep room. Um, so yeah, other than that, there are some good resources. Like I don't know, like I find John Stewart very funny. So I would watch some of him. Like he is a great example of like setup, punchline, and segue. You know what I mean? And calling back to it throughout like a lengthy episode, which I think is something that extempers can do very strategically and very well as well. Other than that, one resource I would recommend is like r/ not the onion on Reddit has like really funny but real news stories because like the onion, but it's like not the onion because it's real, you know what I mean? So that's a Yeah, cool. That's a good way to like get inspiration for humor. Um, I'm gonna ask super random question. What do you think about spoken word poetry for emotional impact lines? I asked about singing the other day. I was told lyrics were fine, but singing them is not. I was wondering about poetry. It's very emotional, typically not song. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend singing anything next time. But I'm not sure entirely what you mean by like spoken word poetry. Like, I don't know, like you shouldn't like just like, T.S. Eliot, like I'm gonna borrow your power line, you know what I mean? But um I do know some extempers who have like used poetry as inspiration for like their statements of significance. So it's something if it's something you're very into, then I would totally recommend incorporating it into your style. I think it would be something that would be very unique and very interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead.
All right, follow-up question. Do you know how do you memorize your speech during the prep time?
Yeah, I don't know, man. Personally, I don't really have the best like short-term memory. Like I have a very good long-term memory, but my short-term memory is a little bit bad, right? That's why I spend more time. Sorry. That's why I spend more time memorizing my speech than a lot of other people do. Um, yeah. For me, something that helps me is memorizing the substructure. So like I if you memorize that it's like past, present, future, for instance, in this question, it's easier to recall the specific claims and warrants within the points because you have that general framework of like something happened in the past and something happened in the present and something's going to happen in the future you can call back on. And that makes it easier to recall the specific claims that come with the points. Other than that, like repetition is very key. There are a lot of like memorization strategies. Like some people do like their memory palaces or whatever. Like that's never worked for me. Um, some people like associate sources with specific colors that makes it easier for them to recall. Some people have like specific acronyms for certain sources that makes them easier to recall. So there are a variety of like memorization techniques that you can try. Um, just like some people like write their sources by hand and that makes it easier for them to recall. That doesn't really help me either. Um, like I said before, the way that people prep is very, very individualistic. And Extemp is not like remotely a one size fits all activity. So it's difficult for me to tell you like you should memorize this way because it might just not work for you, you know what I mean? So try a variety of different tactics and see what works for you and then go from there would be my general advice. I know that's a very unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry.